Thank you and welcome back. It's good to be back after a short break. This morning, I'm hoping that we peeled enough apples and found them to be without cores, that we got a little bit of a sense through that metaphor of the relationship between the three natures and the ways in which the three natures are meant to provide a kind of analysis of how objects appear to us and what the role is of our own subjectivity in their constitution. This, of course, is just very preliminary, but it's a good beginning. And today we're going to talk about more metaphors. Before I do that, I want to address one question that came in over the air in between the two sessions, because I think it's a very important one to be clear about. The person asking the question worried that I am disparaging the Prasangika Madhyamaka tradition, and that I'm doing so by defending the Yogacara tradition as co-equal and correct and interesting, even though many of the great masters of the Prasangika Madhyamaka tradition refute and reject Yogacara. And so this person asks, if I really believe that, and if we're really to believe that, then we have to believe that the great masters of the Prasangika Madhyamaka tradition are not correct in all respects, may not be omniscient perhaps, and that we then would have no reason to trust them or to believe them, and that this would destroy faith in the Prasangika Madhyamaka tradition. I understand the force of that objection and where it's coming from. And I want to say that that is not what I am doing. I do not intend, by articulating the value of the Yogacara tradition, to be denigrating the Prasangika Madhyamaka tradition at all. Nor even do I mean to be rejecting the various refutations of Yogacara that we find in the Prasangika tradition, such as those that we find in the 6th chapter of Madhyamaka Avatara, Chandrakirti's Introduction to the Middle Way, or in Bodhicharya Avatara, Shantideva's How to Lead an Awakened Life in the 9th chapter. Those are refutations of understanding Yogacara as a metaphysics, as an account of the nature of phenomena, as any reading of Yogacara that would argue that the mind is substantially real and external objects are completely non-existent. I think those are very good refutations of that position, the position that the mind is substantially real and that external objects are completely non-existent. I leave that alone. Instead, what I'm trying to do is to suggest that there are other ways to read Yogacara texts, ways to read Yogacara texts that allow us to draw great meaning from them and to see them as complementary to the Prasangika tradition. This is not meant at all to undermine the greatness of Chandrakirti, the greatness of Shantideva, or of other Prasangika Madhyamaka masters. It's rather meant to say that there are a lot of great masters in the Indian Buddhist tradition, Chinese Buddhist tradition, Tibetan Buddhist tradition for that matter, and that very often by reading a multiplicity of different texts, we can gain greater insight. So I hope that what I'm saying can be taken in that spirit, not in a combative spirit. I'm not trying to go in here to do battle. I'm trying to go in here actually to say, let's not do battle. Let's try to put these texts together and these thinkers together and these traditions together and try to work from a harmony of these traditions. So please take what I'm doing in that sense and not as an act of disrespect to the Prasangika tradition. So I am going to pause only for one moment or two to see whether there are questions from the Abbey that I should answer from this morning before I go on. And then I'm going to, as requested, rattle on for an hour or more before I address more questions. So this is your chance to stop me cold before I get going. Otherwise, the momentum will take over and you'll be stuck with me. Okay. Oh, there is a question. Aha.
This this isn't a clearly articulated question, but we were wondering if you were going to talk about latencies and, as regards the three natures and the three non-natures. And we were also wondering what scriptures the talk of latencies comes from.
So by latencies, again, we have to make sure we're translating the same way. You're talking about predispositions in the Alaya Vijnana.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to make sure we were both on the same translation page. I will be talking about those not immediately, but actually when we get to Dignaga's Alambana Pariksha, where Dignaga really brings those to the fore in the 7th and 8th verses. I won't be talking about them before that, only because they don't quite fit into what I'm doing until that moment. It's not because I don't think they're important, it's because they won't quite fit into my program until we get there, but we will get there. And the question was, what scriptures do we find those in? We find those addressed in the Bodhisattva Bhumi by Asanga at great length. We find them addressed in, what I'm trying to imagine is where the sutra sources are for them. Yeah. And I should know the answer to that question. I'm not sure. I want to say the Lankavatara, but I'm not sure that I'm right about that. So let me research that between today and tomorrow. For me, the locus classicus is always Asanga on that, because he's so exquisitely careful about working those things out. And then, of course, they come back to us in Dignaga and Dharmakirti in their discussion of the Alaya Vijnana. But I think Asanga is the place where I would go for the most extensive discussion of those potencies.
Because I'm just looking down here in Sutra Unravelling the Thought in chapter 6, and it mentions predispositions for designations. So that's definitely, the ideas are running through Yogacara quite a lot, but where they're first introduced, I'm honestly not sure. And that's an interesting question. So this is 3rd century, and as I said, some of the earliest fragments of this seem to be even 100 or 200 years older than that. So this is old stuff, but I don't know where the first occurrence is. I'm a lousy historian is the problem. It's just kind of not where I put my focus, which is bad at a moment like this, especially. But we could find that out. I mean, because there are people who know all about that. And the person who really knows all about that is John Powers. And so when I say I'm going to do some research, I'm just going to email John after this and say, hey, John, save me. Because John just knows all these details about the early history of Yogacara, which is one of the many reasons I love John. He's an encyclopedia on these matters. So I will check and I will get back to you, but I really don't know what the earliest mention is. I think I would say the most extensive is definitely in Asanga, but that's definitely not the earliest, right? Because Asanga is coming along well into the development of Yogacara. So I don't know, that's a cool question, but we won't really talk about them much until we get to Dignaga, where they really come up in the discussion of perception and the origin of the Alambana. We can't do everything first. Any other questions before I get going? Yes, in the background. Yeah.
Is actually just like Venerable Children's first question. I was just wondering how the Yogacara school explains how we see the object.
I missed the first part of that. I got how we see the object, but before that it was a little blurry in the sound.
Okay, I think I'm asking the same question as Venerable Children. How does this school explain how we see an object?
Oh, do you mean what the causes are of seeing the object?
Well, I was wanting to ask the question without using words seeds and latencies.
Yeah. I think that it's really important. This is a hard point to make, but I'm going to try to make it. I think it's an important point. And this is something that I said in passing yesterday, but maybe it's a good time to say it in more than passing. I did this in the context of talking about the values and the dangers of doxography. And one of the dangers that I mentioned right near the end was what I always call the doxographic squeeze. And the doxographic squeeze happens when we decide that there's a bunch of tenets or theses associated with a school, and then we impute, like the imagined nature, those theses or those tenets or those ideas to every text and to every thinker who we classify as being in those schools. And that, I think, can be a great danger, because then we often read concerns into particular texts that aren't there, or into particular people who aren't there, just because they might be nearby. Do you know what I mean? And so when we say in this school, how do we explain the origin of perception of objects? I want to take a long, deep breath and say in different ways, depending on who we're talking about and which text we're talking about. So, for instance, even though we do have that mention of predispositions or latencies, and that really is mentioned as dispositions, not that specific seeds or that language of biju or seeds in the Alaya Vijnana. So it's just the general idea of a predisposition, of a karmic predisposition. The Samdhinirmochana doesn't really thematize the idea of perception as being the ripening of potentials in the Alaya Vijnana. That is thematized in other places, but not necessarily here. Just as I don't think that the Samdhinirmochana thematizes idealism very much, even though if we look, say, at Vasubandhu's 20 verses, it does thematize idealism and defend idealism. Trisvabhava Nirdesha doesn't. So I think we have different ideas being developed in different texts. And here, if you were to ask me, what is the voice of the Samdhinirmochana on the origins of perception? I'd say it's in that dependent nature discussion that we talked about this morning. So we're talking about perception in terms of a stream of causal processes, where a lot of those causes and conditions are within our cognitive continuum, and some of them might be outside of that continuum or not, but it's kind of silent about that. That's kind of not what it's writing about. And I think that it becomes a little bit dangerous, even though a very traditional way of doing commentary, to read into this text concerns that are coming from other texts, especially given how early this text is and how late some of those others are. So if we said, oh, gee, Asanga's got all of this to say about the ripening of predispositions in the Alaya Vijnana and the way that it's like a storehouse and so forth, so then we'll read that back into the Samdhi, I think that that's a dangerous imposition of a doctrine that's coming up a little bit later on an earlier text. So I like to be a little bit leaner about that in my interpretation. That is not to say that we never should bring other texts or commentaries to bear on interpretation. That would be crazy. We have to do that. That's the way we read texts in any scholastic tradition, and especially in the Indian tradition, in which texts are really written with the anticipation of commentary and are always responding to a web of other texts. But we have to do it with caution. And so I'm being very, very cautious there and trying to take the Samdhi on its own terms, because there's enough richness there for now. Does that help a little bit? Yeah, but we will get to ripening with potentials when we get to Dignaga, I promise. And then they will ripen and we will have all kinds of perceptions as that goes on. But we have to wait for those potentials to ripen. That'll be a few days. But we can be patient because we know how to be patient. Any other questions before I go on? Okay, then I'm going to rattle on for a while and pick up questions in maybe 45 minutes or an hour or so, unless you interrupt me, which you are welcome to do. But as like I say, I don't mind being interrupted from the Abbey. I won't be interrupted by the Q&A session, though. I'll just let those accumulate and let Damcha curate them in her wonderful, heavy-handed way, so that I don't have to take any blame. Okay. Something that I was thinking about as I was talking about my apple this morning, that I just want to kick back and share with you as a thought about philosophy in general, but the Buddhist tradition in particular, before we dive into this next piece. And that's the importance of metaphor. My principal teacher in graduate school when I was learning, one of his favorite things to say was that philosophy is nothing but stacking up one metaphor on top of another metaphor, like a house of cards, until the entire thing collapses, and then you find new metaphors to stack up. He said, we don't give up a philosophical theory when we show it to be false. We give it up when the metaphor is no longer useful. And we adopt them not because we think that they're true, but because the metaphors help us to see the world better. Now that, I think, is a wonderful bit of hyperbole. We don't want to take all of that literally. Think of it metaphorically for now. But it really does, it is a very insightful point about the way we practice philosophy. And we often, the metaphors become so frozen that we stop seeing them as metaphors. And there I've used another metaphor, right? So it's, and it's easy to lose track of metaphors. And one of the things that I find curiously ironic about the Buddhist tradition is that of all of the philosophical traditions I know, it's the one that is most deeply imbricated with stacks and stacks of metaphors. And they interlock in fascinating ways. That very often you learn almost more by thinking about the relations between the metaphors than by reading any literal texts. I mean, think, for instance, about how fire metaphors work in Buddhism, right? So we've got the skandhas. Well, that's a metaphor already. That's a pile or a heap. But as we know, originally in the old Pali, that's the heap of wood that you pile on top of a corpse, right? So it's a metaphor of something burning, and we find that when we read the Fire Sutta, right? When in that beautiful, very short text where the Buddha says, the world is burning, form is burning, feeling is burning, perception is burning, discrimination is burning, and so forth. He's really talking about the way in which that metaphor works. Then we hook that up to nirvana as the extinction of a flame. And so we've got that fire metaphor continuing, right? We have all these metaphors all over Buddhism. And I love reflecting on the metaphors. And oftentimes, I find that the deepest explanations of an idea in a text aren't in the explicit articulation, but in the metaphors and the images that follow. And that's why I'm going to be spending time on those metaphors today. And I said there's an irony, and I just want you to reflect on this irony. I don't know what to do with it. But in most Indian philosophical systems, when we enumerate the pramanas, the means of gaining knowledge or the warrants, analogy or metaphor is one of the principal ones. And one of the curious things about Buddhism is that when the pramana varans get going, people like Dignaga and Dharmakirti, that's one of the ones they banish. So we take the system that has makes the heaviest use of metaphors, and buried in it is this tradition that claims that they're not a source of knowledge. And I find that to be a very weird irony. I just say thanks for Chandrakirti who brings them back in for us. But that was just something I was thinking about this afternoon that I thought I'd share with you as we move into the two metaphors that are used in chapter 6 to explain the three natures, because I think they're very, very apt and very beautifully constructed metaphors. The other thing to say about those, I'm going to go into them in a moment, is that neither of these metaphors is particularly original with Buddhism. Both of these are kind of pan-Indian metaphors that we find throughout Indian philosophical systems, and Buddhism borrows them, uses them, repurposes them, as a lot of Indian philosophical systems do, which also reminds us of something really, really important. And some people think that it's kind of heretical when I say this. Excuse me if you think that. But one of the most important things to remember about the Buddhist tradition is it's first and foremost an Indian philosophical and religious tradition. It is spread all over the world, and it's been inflected and transformed in every culture that it's entered, and every culture it's entered has been inflected and transformed by it. And that's beautiful and very important to recognize. But its roots are Indian roots, and its roots in that sense lie in a soil that includes all of the Orthodox traditions and the Jain tradition and the Charvaka tradition. And a lot of what we find in Buddhism that we think of as very unique is actually part of a pan-Indian philosophical milieu, repurposed, rethought, reconsidered, sometimes rejected, but we're really entering an Indian way of thinking when we do that.
And that means that we need to remember to cultivate gratitude, not only to the great masters of the Buddhist tradition, but also to the great masters of the other Indian traditions that supported and fed Buddhism, with whom Buddhism was in dialogue, against whom Buddhism was reacting. You can't start a fire with a single stick, to keep the metaphors going. You need to rub a few sticks together. And Buddhism might be one of those sticks in India, but all of these other traditions are the other sticks. And a lot of the fire that we're enjoying today, we owe to other Indian philosophical traditions, which is a kind of sermon that's not just about gratitude, but also a suggestion. It's kind of fun to read non-Buddhist Indian philosophy. And it's not only fun, but you learn a lot about Buddhism when you do it, because you begin to see both what Buddhism was reacting against and also what Buddhism was borrowing. And I think that's a really important thing to see. All right, end of sermon. As you know, I like to think about the practice of philosophy as well as the ideas. Now into the two metaphors. There are two famous metaphors deployed in the 6th chapter to explain the three natures. The first one is the metaphor of, and now translators start fighting. I just take what my ophthalmologist calls them, floaters. In India, they're called falling hairs or things like that. But they are the illusion that you can have as a result of certain kinds of damage to the eye of things falling in your visual field. And there's a lot, it turns out there are a couple of different ophthalmic conditions that can give rise to this. The prevalence of this metaphor in India suggests that the ophthalmologist left something to be desired. But there we have it. Anyway, we call them floaters, and I've never experienced them, thankfully. But the idea is that, you can get these from diseases of the vitreous fluid in the eye, but also from detached retina sometimes, where you get this feeling that there are things falling through your visual field. And the metaphor is cashed out very tightly. The imagined nature is held to be analogous to the floaters themselves, to the hairs that you see in your visual field. And it's important to see, I'm going to want to be fastidious about these metaphors. When we think about floaters, they are an illusion, but they are an illusion that we see. So it doesn't do you any good to say, oh, this isn't really perception, because there's no real object there. Because imagine, suppose this happens to you, right? Suppose that there's a big brawl at Sravasti Abbey, and people end up coming to blows, and your eye gets injured. Yeah, it's about to happen. Don't try this, actually. And you develop floaters, and you go to the ophthalmologist, and she asks you, well, how many do you see? You can count them, right? And somebody might have only a few, and somebody might have more. And I point this out because that means there can be truth and falsity with respect to them. This is a point that Chandrakirti makes, but is also apposite in the Yogacaran context. The reason that we want to say that they're real objects is because we can distinguish truth and falsity with respect to them. It might be true that you only see 5 or 6, and false that you see 100. It might be true that they seem to be falling from left to right, and false that they seem to be going from bottom to top. And because there's a distinction between truth and falsity with respect to them, they have a kind of reality as objects of experience. I think that's really important. And by the way, that's an idea that lies very much at the core of the epistemology and the metaphysics of the Gelug tradition. So when Jay Rinpoche talks about the need to take conventional truth and conventional reality seriously, one of his principal arguments is that there's a difference between getting it right and wrong about conventional reality. And if there's a difference between getting it right and wrong, there's a reality to it. That's a very, very powerful sort of philosophical intuition. So coming back to the metaphor, the hairs that are perceived, the floaters, are like the imagined nature. How are they like the imagined nature? Well, they're like the imagined nature in that they are actual objects of perception.
that we take to be real independently of us, that we take ourselves to encounter, just like my apple. But we know, because the best ophthalmologists tell us that all they are artifacts of our own eye disease. So while it might be true that I've got 6 floaters and you've got 10, it's not true of my floaters or of yours that they exist independently of us and our perceptual systems. They are internal to them, and in that sense, they are illusory. They appear to be external, they appear to be independent, but they are internal. And that's the sense of the metaphor. Again, I just want to emphasize that if you just say, oh, that just means they're non-existent, you haven't scratched the surface or the cornea of the metaphor. To get the whole metaphor correct, you've got to really dive into it and see all of these features of it. There's an apparent duality of subject and object, I and the thing that it's seeing, but they're actually both packed into the I. That duality is illusory. They exist in one way, they appear in another way. They exist as facts about my eye and my visual faculty. They appear to be objects in my environment. I treat them, but they are real objects that have a real mode of appearance. But that mode of appearance leads me to superimpose a kind of reality on them that they don't have. All of that is packed into that little bit of metaphor. He paused. He stopped pausing. Then it continues that the dependent nature is like the appearance of the hairs or the appearance of the floaters. Note how finely the author of the sutra is parsing words and developing the ontology. He's explaining to us that there's a difference between the hairs and the appearance of the hairs, between the floaters and their appearance to us. Notice that the appearance is, in one sense, you might want to say, I want to say this in a very broad and general way, don't pin me down to an analysis here, but sort of realer and more basic than the hairs themselves. And here's the sense of that. You go to the ophthalmologist and you say, well, the problem I'm having is that there's hairs every place in space, every place I look. And she says to you, don't worry, those hairs aren't real. They're just an appearance. The appearance of them is what we have to worry about. That is, we're not going to open up your eye and take hairs out. We're going to open up your eye and operate on it so that it stops appearing as hairs. That's really important. You don't expect that after the surgery, you can see the little tray full of hairs that have been removed from your visual field. Why not? Here's why not. There weren't any. But there was an appearance, and now there is no more appearance. So what we remove when we remove the hairs is we remove the appearance. The appearance of the hairs, which is a real process in your visual faculty, is experienced by you as the perception of external hairs, just as the dependent nature is experienced as the perception of an independently existing, external, dually related object of experience that looks in a particular way. So the detail here is just so tight, so precise, so delicate. We're not distinguishing between what exists and what doesn't exist, but we're distinguishing between the process that gives rise to the perception of an object and the object to which that process gives, to the perception of which this process gives rise. Sometimes it's hard to get out of a sentence when you're making them up on the fly. Does that help a little bit? Is that really clear? Because I don't want to leave till it's clear. You're muted, which makes you very unclear. Unmute thyselves.
Please repeat.
I will repeat. I might not repeat precisely, but I'll repeat as precisely as I can. Slowly, okay.
So we can understand Take it in.
Boom. Set the metronome to 40. Okay. So the idea is this. The sutra here, in developing this analogy, is developing it with extreme precision and asking you to read it and to ponder it with equal precision. I think that's important. In my experience teaching, I often find that people skate over these metaphors and analogies. And they say, oh, I just got the real exposition earlier. The metaphor is just for window dressing or just for entertainment. It's not. There's a lot to learn from these. And when the metaphors are very carefully constructed, we really learn by paying attention to the detail of the construction. So I want to take us back to the ophthalmologist's office. And I go to my ophthalmologist and I say, you know, I first went to the environmental scientists to try to get them to get the hairs out of my house, but they said there weren't any hairs there. They told me that I should come to you. They said you could get rid of the hairs because, boy, I see these hairs. Now, what you don't want to say is to say right away, well, that's just a complete illusion. I'm not seeing anything. There's nothing there to be seen. Because that would really be to fail to appreciate the fact that there is a kind of object of experience and even an object of knowledge here. And here's why I say that. And here, in order to explain what's happening in the Samdhina Mochana, I'm really drawing on Jay Rinpoche, and his analysis of how we know when we've got a real object of knowledge that we have to take seriously. And it's an issue that he takes up in the context of insisting that we must take conventional truth seriously. Now, what he points out is that when you've got a real difference between truth and falsity with respect to something, a difference between getting it right and getting it wrong, then you'd better pay attention to that something about which you could possibly get it right or get it wrong. For instance, I can't get it right or get it wrong about the length of the wings in the fairy who inhabits my study. And the reason is there's no such fairy. So there's no truth about how long her wings are, and there's no falsity about how long her wings are. There's no truth or falsity about how many teeth there are in the dragon flying over my house, because there's no dragon flying over my house. But there is truth or falsity with respect to where my dog is right now, right next to me. That's true, and it's false that he's flying over the house. Even if he's only conventionally existent, there's truth and falsity with respect to him. And that's why we need to take conventional objects seriously. So that idea, that insight, that we really have an object of experience or an object of knowledge, when we can actually say something true or false about it, it's a very powerful intuition in Buddhist epistemology. And that's being mobilized here. So that when I go to my ophthalmologist and she says, okay, I promise you there are no hairs in the room right now, but what I want to know is how many hairs you see. And I say, oh, I see about 6 of them. She says, are you sure? I count them. I say, yeah, I see about 6. She said, that's great. That's at least better than seeing 100. Some of my patients see 100. And so what that means is that these hairs are real appearances. They're real, but they're real as real objects of knowledge, not real hairs. Just like a mirage is a real refraction pattern, but not real water. The mode of existence and the mode of appearance of them are distinct. That's why they're deceptive, but they are real objects of knowledge. So the sutra draws the analogy here between the imagined nature and the hairs. That is, every object has an imagined nature. We imagine it to be external to us, independent of us. We imagine it to be just as we perceive it. We imagine it to be dualistically related to our subjectivity.
And that's how we experience the hairs. We experience them as external to us, as existing just in the way they appear, as dualistically related to us, even though they're not. Now remember, we can't push the analogies too far. All metaphors limp, but the metaphor does pretty well so far. Then when we get to the dependent nature, the distinction is drawn very, very finely. And I think it's important to see that that distinction is fine, because the sutra is inviting you to draw a very fine and very careful distinction between the imagined nature and the dependent nature. The dependent nature here is said to be like the appearance of the hairs. So the distinction that we're drawing with a very, very sharp scalpel, you want your ophthalmologist to have a very sharp scalpel, is between the hairs and their appearance. And what I'm trying to point out is, even though this is kind of the wrong way to put it, that one is realer than the other, one is a little more fundamental than the other, and that is the appearance. So that when your ophthalmologist does the surgery to eliminate the floaters, what she doesn't do is pull a bunch of hairs out of your eyes. The reason that she doesn't is because there weren't any there in the first place. They really were an appearance that doesn't have a kind of underlying reality. What there was a condition of your eye that gave rise to the appearance. And what she's done is to eliminate that appearance. So the appearance of the hairs is a little realer. That's an actual biological process. The hairs aren't a real biological process. The appearance is. It's a real causal process, and it gives rise to the illusion that there are hairs, just as the dependent nature can give rise to the illusion, if we read it in the right way, that the things that they experience have the imagined nature, that imagined nature is real. And so the distinction between the imagined nature and the dependent nature is analogous to the distinction between the hairs and the appearance of the hairs. The appearance of the hairs is the actual causal process. The hairs are the way that process is experienced. Just like the dependent nature of the apple is the causal process that gives rise to its perception. The imagined nature is the way that I perceive it once that appearance has been generated. Does that help? Is that clear enough? It's a very, very subtle analogy. This is not something you want to skate over quickly. It's a very, very, very subtle point. And then the consummate nature is analogous to the unmistaken visual field when the eye is returned to health. So when I walk out of the ophthalmologist's office, or I will come out of the surgery and she says, "What do you see now?" And what do I see? The complete absence of hairs, and I rejoice. Notice what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing, and that's causing me to rejoice, that's causing the end of my ophthalmic suffering, you might say, is a pure negation, the absence of any hairs. And that's the consummate nature, a pure negation. Now, there might be things lying behind it, like maybe the walls of the office, but they're not part of the analogy, right? I'm not rejoicing because I can see the walls of the office. I'm rejoicing because I see an absence of hairs in my visual field. And so it's the absence of those hairs that is analogous to the consummate nature. Now, notice a few nice things about this analogy. And again, I don't want to push it any further than that. There's lots of ways in which if you push a metaphor too far, then you start doing spurious stuff with it. Excuse me. But there's some really nice things about this metaphor. One is that it draws our attention to the kind of temporal path dimension of cultivation, right? We start out really focusing on the imagined nature, and we end up, with any luck, seeing the consummate nature. We start out unhappy with what we see, even if we
take it, I mean, they might be really pretty hairs, right? But even if the hairs are pretty, you're not happy if your visual field is littered with hairs you know that don't exist, right? You go to the doctor, you don't say, wow, I got a free kaleidoscope. What you say is, oh, damn, something really bad has happened to my vision. So suffering is associated with the imagined nature, and a release from suffering is associated with the consummate nature. And in either case, what we have underlying that is a causal process that accounts for these things that we're not kind of immediately aware of, but that we could either experience as something very positive, that is, as a positive presence, like the hairs, or experience the absence of that presence once we consummate our understanding as the absence of the hairs. Nonetheless, to keep the metaphor going, and again, it gets hard to map everything perfectly, but it kind of works. What we've got are three natures of the hairs. These aren't natures of my perception or of my subjectivity. They're facts about the hairs. The hairs appear to be real. They are given rise to by a medical condition that I'm not directly, that is manifesting itself through the appearance of hairs. And they really don't exist in the way that they appear. And those three natures, their non-existence, their appearance, and their causal basis, are present in them as long as they are objects of consciousness. And that's kind of cool. So it's a very, very rich metaphor, even though it seems like a quick throwaway. That's metaphor number one. I apologize if I'm spending too much time on what sounds like just an image, but honestly, for me anyway, I find that if I contemplate these metaphors carefully and spell them out, my understanding of the position that's being articulated is deepened, and that very often it's easier to put the metaphor in my pocket and carry it with me than the philosophical exposition, because I might forget the details of that, but I remember the metaphor and I can pull it out and contemplate it. So they're nice kind of cheat cards for getting your mind focused where it ought to be. I also, I mean, this is just me, I also marvel at the literary dexterity of the people who composed these sutras and the way they deployed these metaphors to make philosophical points. I can't do that, so I'm kind of impressed. The second metaphor is another one that's a kind of pan-Indian metaphor that gets used a lot in Buddhism. And that's the metaphor of the crystal on a colored background. And we see this a lot in Indian philosophy. So what you want to imagine is that a very generous donor brings a very large diamond to Sravasti Abbey as a donation. And before you go out to sell it on the black market, you want everybody to enjoy it. And so you put it on a beautiful blue cloth to look at. And lo and behold, what you thought was a very clear diamond suddenly looks blue. You don't worry, because you know that this is kind of what happens when you put a clear crystal on a blue cloth. But what you're looking at now, when you look at that diamond, is the deep navy blue of the cloth pervading the diamond itself. And so now we do the analogy again. The dependent nature is the clear crystal. It's the causal process that's mediating the perception or the perceptible color. The imagined nature is like the color that that crystal appears to have. So the diamond doesn't have any color by itself. Now when you put it there, appears to be blue. And so you say, oh my gosh, I thought they gave us a diamond, but really they gave us a sapphire. And you're fooled for, well, you know, maybe you were fooled, but you might be fooled for a moment and say, oh, I thought it was a diamond. It's only a sapphire because look, it's really deep blue. And the consummate nature is the fact that it really doesn't have that blue color, that the diamond itself is clear and absent that blue color. So once again, what the object that we're perceiving here, The object is a blue appearing diamond. That's the object of experience. That's what we're seeing. And again, we kind of chant to ourselves, what object am I talking about? I am talking about the object that appears to my consciousness. And if I'm looking at the clear diamond on a blue cloth, what appears to my consciousness is a blue crystal. But the imagined nature is our imputation of the color blue to the crystal, even though it doesn't belong on the crystal from its own side. The dependent nature is the clarity of the crystal that allows the blue to shine through. And the consummate nature is the complete absence of blue in the crystal. And again, it's just a very tight, very clear analogy. But once again, we see that that blue crystal appearing in my consciousness has all three of those natures. It has the characteristic of appearing blue, the imagined nature. It has the characteristic of being a kind of causal conduit for the blueness of the cloth, the dependent nature. And it has the characteristic of not being blue at all, the consummate nature. And to completely understand that object of experience is to understand that it has all three of those natures. If I don't, then I'm missing something. And that part's really important.
You said before that the dependent nature is the clear crystal that's like a causal process. What does causal process mean?
Well, what I mean by that is that it allows the colored light to pass through it. And so for you to see it as blue. And notice that that's a little bit different from it's lacking any color at all, because you could imagine it's lacking any color but being opaque. So the idea here is, and again, it's an analogy and not a perfect analogy, but a pretty good analogy. When we think about the dependent nature, what we're asking is, what is it that really accounts for? What is the underlying kind of thing that we're imputing blueness to? And what enables us to do that? What's the process that's happening? What's the dependent origination? And the network of causes and conditions involves both the blueness, well, involves, I don't want to say both, I'm going to end up with two things. Involves the blueness of the cloth, the nature of our eyes and our visual faculties, but also the transparency of the crystal that allows it to take on the appearance of blue when the cloth is placed on it. So that's why we've got a dependent nature there. My own feeling is, by the way, that the floater analogy is a more revealing one than this one, but they're both pretty good analogies. And they're both analogies you can stick in your pocket and carry with you and reflect on. And as you reflect on them, you begin to see that in order to understand either the floaters or to understand the blue crystal, you need to understand all of these three aspects, even though, now the drum roll comes, none of them are intrinsic to the object. That's really important. They're all extrinsic, relational, dependently originated properties. They are not intrinsic, ultimate properties of the object. That's what I meant by intrinsic there. So they're natures, but they're not intrinsic natures. We're not talking about the object of negation here. I think people get tripped up on that, and this only occurred to me this morning, and I didn't want to dive into it then because things were so complicated then, but this is a small verbal point, but an important verbal point. One of the reasons that I think that some people are tempted to think that Yogacharans are falling back into reifying the object of negation, that is attributing an ultimate nature to things. When Madhyamika has criticized that so successfully, is just because of the use of the term here. These are called the Tri Swabhavas, the three natures, or the three, Swabhavas, self-natures or whatever, right? And Swabhava is identified as the object of negation when we're talking about emptiness, that is Rangshin, But the word Svabhava, we have to remember in Sanskrit, it's a word with very, very wide use. And it can be used very technically in Madhyamaka to refer to the object of negation, the essence or intrinsic nature, but can also just be used to refer to a characteristic that things have. So often we use that term just to talk about the hotness of fire, even when we're just talking about that conventionally. And so so this is double-edged. This is a kind of plea for interpretative charity, you might say. When I can imagine good reasons to look at Yogacara and Madhyamaka and to say, Madhyamaka says there's no Svabhava. Yogacara doesn't just say there is Svabhava, it says there's 3 of them. God, how more different could they possibly be? And that's when doxography comes to the rescue. Doxography comes to the rescue because doxography reminds us that the same term might have different meanings in different tenet systems, in different doxographic frames. And the term Svabhava used in the 3 Svabhavas, in the 3 natures, doesn't mean the same thing as the Svabhava that Prasangikas are after. I think that's important to remember. It's kind of a nice verbal point to make at this moment when we're talking about things having 3 natures. And I think that can cause unnecessary confusion if we think that word has exactly one meaning that has to always be the same meaning. We have to be careful when we use words, both to use them precisely, but also to recognize that there might be multiple precise uses of the same term. That's true in English, that's true in Tibetan, that's true in Sanskrit. And we just have to remember that. So I have reached the end of what I wanted to say about the 6th chapter. And so I want to pause now before beginning to talk about the very long and important 7th chapter, to ask if there are questions about 6th chapter ideas and the things that we're talking about now. I've got a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I'm turning to the Abbey first to ask if so far we're okay. Okay. Then I'm going to pick up these 2 questions.
Oh, wait, sorry. I have 2 questions.
Oh, good.
The disembodied voice. So if we close read the section where he talks about how, he likens the clear crystal coming in contact with a color to how the other dependent character comes in contact with the predispositions for conventional designations that are the imputational character.
Yeah.
So so with the hairs, we got the biological process producing the appearance of the hairs.
Yeah.
So now is he doing something with mental latencies, predispositions, producing the appearance that is the other dependent character?
That's a really good question. And the answer is maybe, but maybe not. And I think that I think that's underdetermined. Those could simply be our kind of psychological tendency to impute, right? To imagine and project the way things appear to external objects, as in the case of the apple. It could be a reference to something like seeds or predispositions in the Alaya Vijnana. The text really isn't clear about that. And so if what you're, and I just think there's multiple ways to read that. So I kind of pull back from that a little bit. If what you wanted to do was to read this text strongly in the context of other Yogacaran texts that are talking about the ripening of potentials in the Alaya Vijnana, then that would be the right way to do it. But I don't see that happening in the rest of this chapter. And so I'm a little hesitant to go that far in interpretation. And all I'd want to say is that the Yogacarans, that whoever the authors of this text are obviously agreeing that as human beings or as ordinary sentient beings, we have a predisposition to project appearances into an imagination of things existing dualistically as they're perceived. how we understand those dispositions, I think, is kind of left neutral here. And so I've thought about that, and I've just thought it's underdetermined by the text there, and you could interpret it either way, and I'd be happy with anybody reading it either way. Sometimes I just pull back and say, not enough basis for giving a definite interpretation. Other question?
Okay, yeah. The other one comes toward the end of the chapter, right? Where now the Buddha starts to explain to Gunakara how to realize, how you should understand each of the natures.
Yes.
Yeah. So he says, Gunakara, in dependence upon names that are connected with signs, the imputational character is known. Okay.
Yep.
Then he says, in dependence upon strongly adhering to the other dependent character as being the imputational character, the other dependent character is known. That just totally threw me off. Like, I thought the point was to distinguish the two.
Right. But what he's talking about there is a kind of process of coming to understand their relations. So when we talk about the relationship between the imputational character and the other dependent character, what we have to see is that to understand the other dependent, to understand the dependent nature, we have to understand that that is the very nature upon which the imagined nature is superimposed. They're not completely independent or different from one another. You can't sort of pull them out as three totally independent natures of things. So you can imagine that something could have one of them or two of them, but not the other one. This is emphasizing that idea that in order to understand an object of knowledge, we have to understand the sense in which and the way in which it has all three of those natures and that they're intimately connected. And so you don't really understand the other dependent nature unless you get this kind of idea that it's the thing to which we attach the imagined nature. Just as he says a moment later, it's also the thing from which we detach the imagined nature in the consummate nature, right? So understanding the other dependent nature involves understanding there's two directions in which it faces. The imputation of the imputational base for the imagined nature and the thing that is empty of the imagined nature. So that's why, that's another reason to think of it as a kind of pivot between the two natures. To understand it, you have to understand its relation to both of those. So that whole little paragraph has to be taken together. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I agree with you that it's not nearly as clear and explicit as you would like, but hey, it's sutra literature, and sutras are kind of written to give commentators a job. This is kind of, in scholastic traditions, an employment creation program. And if sutras were totally clear, commentators would be unemployed. But the real idea here is to read those two sentences together. One is that it's the adherence of the imputational to the dependent that explains the kind of conventional face of the dependent, and it's the freedom from the imputational or the imagined that explains the ultimate facing nature of the dependent. It's kind of nice when you kind of work it out, but it is complicated, I agree. Thank you for that question. I probably shouldn't have decided to skip over that. But so thank you for forcing me not to. Other questions from the app? Did that help? Was that explanation clear enough?
Yeah, the explanation was clear. Yeah,
okay.
It's just that it's not in the text, as you say.
That's right. The text is terse, and sometimes you have to kind of expand it with reference to the other text that's around it. And it's not always easy. And it also helps to read commentaries. Other questions from the Abbey about 6th chapter stuff or other stuff I've been rambling about? Okay, we can always get more going. Let me take some of the questions from the Q&A panel right now, because some of those are very good questions. And then after we've talked about those, I'll give as much time as we can to the beginning of the 7th chapter, the Paramartha Samagata chapter. But we don't need to rush. We'll see where we are. Connor McCann says, I'm still struggling with how to fit the second nature into the scheme. I tried to draw the whole scheme out, but I didn't do a very good job of it. I don't know where to put a neutral verb in because Yogacara has the perspective of an actor. I see the problem there. I think that I'm hoping that the analogies that we looked at today helped that somewhat. As I said, in particular, the little discussion that we just had, we need to think of that other dependent nature as this kind of interesting pivot, the dependently originated phenomena that can either be understood through the imagined nature or understood through the consummate nature. And each of those reflects a different kind of subjectivity on the dependent nature. The dependent nature allows us to connect the objects of experience, the objects of knowledge, to the subjects of knowledge, but it doesn't yet tell us how they're experienced. And it leaves open the kind of ordinary experience through the dependent nature and the more awakened experience through the consummate nature. What I want to emphasize is that all of those are natures of the object of experience. And this is part of analyzing how things appear to subjects. Sagar Rao says, it seems that to see the consummate nature, the lack of floaters, the ophthalmologist has to modify your biological processes. It seems that healing the eye is getting rid of the dependent nature. Yeah. That does stretch the metaphor too far. Like I said, metaphors limp. They're metaphors. And if you stretch them too far, they break. So I wouldn't worry too much about all the details of the surgery. The scalpel and the anesthesiologist and the chair in the room have nothing to do with the analogy either. You're right, once we stretch it, we can't quite fit all of the pieces together. The real point is that it's not so much the surgery, it's the absence of the floaters that is the consummate nature, and the appearance of the floaters that's the dependent nature, and the floaters that's the imagined nature. Don't push these too far. Anytime you do that with a metaphor, it breaks. I'm now going to jump to Ellen Wolf, who asks a really neat question about the way that I explained the relationship between natures and objects, and forces me once again to clarify where I may have been unclear. Ellen says, I didn't understand the point I made about all three natures being extrinsic to the sense, to the object, in the sense that I don't understand, she just jumped away from me, there we go, the distinction between the concept of the three extrinsic as compared to the third consummate nature itself. Okay, here's what that means. What I'm trying to emphasize when I talk about these things as not being intrinsic, and extrinsic might be a dangerous term to use too, because there's another term lurking around in Sanskrit here, parabhava, that we want to avoid as well. But just to emphasize that when we talk about these natures, we're not talking about an essence or a quality that the object has from its own side, just as it is. That is the object of negation for any ultimate analysis, the idea that things have an intrinsic nature, a swabhava in that very technical sense of swabhava that we use in Madhyamaka. And so what I'm trying to point out is that when Yogacara philosophers use this word swabhava, which they do in tree swabhava theory, three nature theory, they're using it in a light sense. And I want to also point out that Chandrakirti himself uses it often in that light sense. So Chandrakirti will talk about swabhava in a conventional ordinary sense, and then also talks about swabhava as the object of negation. And it just means that this term is used in several different ways in Sanskrit, just as we often use terms in slightly different ways. We don't mean an ultimate nature, we mean a conventional dependently originated nature here. And the reason we can say that the three natures of any phenomenon are conventional or non-intrinsic or non-ultimate in this sense, is that they all rely upon the relationship of the object to a subject, to subjectivity. That's why we're talking about emptiness from the side of the subject. So to go back to the analogies that I used this morning, I might say that, you know, my mother has the nature of a mom. It's Mother's Day, I can use these examples. And she does, but that nature is dependent upon her having children to mother. So it's not something that is just there in her from her own side, it's there, it's something that's dependent. If I have a $10 bill in my hand, it may have the nature of being worth $10, but I don't find that in the paper. That involves relations to the Federal Reserve and printing presses and the economy and things like that. So just because we say that the nature of fire is to burn, we don't have to mean that it's an intrinsic nature of fire, an essence of fire, of the kind that Madhyamikas are attacking. That's the only point that I wanted to make there, that one way to convince yourself that Madhyamika and Yogacara are irreconcilably opposed to one another. One way to do that is to say, God, it's easy. Madhyamikas say there's no natures, Yogacharans say there's three. That's a big disagreement. I just want to say, not so fast. Madhyamikas say that there's no intrinsic nature in things, and Yogacharans say that things have three ordinary kinds of light natures, and that's not yet a contradiction. It's only a contradiction if you start treating one of those natures as the kind of intrinsic nature that is the object of negation in Prasangika Madhyamika ultimate analysis. And while you might be able to make an argument that that's happening sometimes, I don't think that's what we see in the text that we are reading today. That's what I meant there. And that is exactly what Blaine Snow asked, so I'm going to ignore his question since I just answered it by accident. Tupten Lobsang La asks the question, in looking at the crystal metaphor and reflecting on the floater metaphor, I wonder why the dependent nature is not identified as our perception or experience of the crystal. Aha. Or the appearance as the appearance of floaters, the appearance of blueness in the crystal exists as an object of experience. There's a good reason for that, I think. Maybe not a great reason, but at least a good reason. Again, metaphors are approximate, but I think there is an important idea here. The author of the sutra does not want you to come away thinking that the dependent nature is a nature of your experience or subjectivity. It's a nature of the object as experienced. This is just such a hard thing to keep focused on. And it's something on which we justifiably spent a lot of time this morning, and we're justifiably going to return to now. There's a difference between saying that something is a nature of experience and saying it's a nature of an object of experience. The Trisvabhavas, the three natures, are natures of the objects of experience, not the natures of experience. They're dependent upon experience, but they're not natures of experience. So for instance, now I'm going to offer a dangerous analogy. Dangerous because I haven't thought it through and it might fall apart as I articulate it. When I have my glasses on, the objects of my experience are rather crisp and clear. When I take my glasses off, the objects of my experience are fuzzy blobs. I better put them back on. My experience isn't fuzzy or clear. It's the objects that I experience. But they're fuzzy or clear because of their relationship to my subjectivity and the nature of my consciousness and my eyes and so forth. But the fuzziness or clearness is a fuzziness or clearness in the object, even though it depends upon my subjectivity. And then I might ask myself the question, what kind of being must I be that sometimes the objects of my experience are crystal clear, like when I have glasses on, and sometimes they become all fuzzy, Imagine if I gave the following answer. I can transform the world as it is by taking my glasses on and off. Right now, the people I see have facial features that are distinguishable. I will now erase their faces. Such power I have, right? Boy, is that dumb, you might say. It's as dumb as ordinary everyday perception, right? In ordinary everyday perception, we think that the way things appear to us are the way they are. But the natures are the natures of the things as they appear to us that depend upon our subjectivity. When we do our phenomenological investigation, when I worry about, when I ask the question, what kind of being must I be? The wrong answer is a really powerful one. The right answer is a being who's got really bad eyes. So the answer to the question about why the objects of my knowledge change has to do with my subjectivity, not the objects. The nature is the nature of the objects, but what determines that nature is subjectivity. That's why it's not an intrinsic nature. That's why what I need to pay attention to is the subject side. But what I'm paying attention to is the conditions under which the objects of my experience have the characteristics that they do. Yeah, that analogy didn't work too badly. Sometimes I get it right. Okay, good. Does that help a little bit? I hope it does. Taryn asks the question, I suppose this, just the window sometimes jumps. That's why my screams. Nothing bad is happening to me. I suppose this applies to Madhyamaka as well, but is there anything to be said of things as they exist independent or outside of the mind? Does the fact that there's a causal process taking place suggest that there are things outside of our experience, some kind of sense data of which we can't speak? Simply saying that phenomena must be mediated by the mind doesn't mean that there's not a way things exist independent of the mind, so forth, right? So this is really the argument about idealism in a fundamental way. And you can take all of these considerations and try to mount idealistic arguments or counter-idealistic arguments. That would be to really worry about the metaphysics of things. And when we do Madhyamaka, we really do that quite a bit. We really kind of try to figure out what the nature of reality is. Do objects exist externally to us or not? Do external objects exist in the same way or in a different way as the mind or not? Those are important questions. Here's what I'm trying to focus us on though. Those aren't the questions that our Yogacharan masters are asking. They're asking about which apple? The apple that is the object of my consciousness right now. The apple that I perceive right now. Not any apple that I don't perceive. Not any apple that exists outside of my experience. And what they're asking is, that experienced apple, what is its nature? And what are the conditions of my consciousness that enable it to have that nature? We've got to keep our eye on the apple here. It's really possible to lose the philosophical focus in a very subtle way and say, oh, what we're really asking is, does the apple really exist? Nobody's asking that question because the apple that I experience obviously really exists. Do you know how I know? I experience it. So it exists as an object of knowledge. Now, the question I need to ask is, what's its mode of existence? Does it exist independently of my mind or dependently on my mind? If dependently, what's the nature of the dependence? Does it actually have the properties that I imagine it to have? Or is it empty of those properties? If it's empty of those properties, why is it that I see them as having those properties? Those are the questions that I'm asking. Just like I ask my ophthalmologist, if the world is really empty of hairs, why do I see so many of them? And she says, don't worry, I can tell you and I can make them go away. And those are questions that take for granted the existence of the hairs as objects of my perception. They're not asking about what the hairs are like independent of that perception. That's really important. So again, I'm not trying to totally dodge the metaphysical questions, though I am. And I'm not dodging them because they're not good questions. They are. Instead, I'm trying to drive us to what is distinctive and I think rather glorious about Yogacara. And that's in part that it's not asking those questions, it's bracketing them and asking instead a question about the nature of consciousness based upon an analysis of the natures of the objects of consciousness. Karen asks the question, does the clear crystal explain how the dependent nature is open to being influenced and obscured by the imagined nature and open to be freed of the imagined nature? Yes, it does. Because the clear crystal can either appear blue and become totally saturated with blueness by putting it on the cloth, even though the blueness isn't in the crystal. But all I need to do is pick that crystal up in my tweezers and hold it up to light. And there is a total emptiness of the blue. So it's a really nice analysis of that. All you've got to do is take it off the cloth. And Blaine asks me, can I say more about the relationship, not my Blaine, but the other Blaine. My wife is named Blaine, and there's somebody taking the course named Blaine, so I've always got two Blaines in my mind. Can you say more about the relationship between the consummate nature and emptiness? Is ultimate truth from a different side, subjective versus objective? And all I can say to that question is, what a perfect segue to chapter 7, because that's what chapter 7 is all about. So we're going to let the Untitled Sutra answer that question, not me, I promise. And I promise we'll get there. And that kind of ends the question and answer panels, which is nice. And so I will give one more chance for the Abbey to slow me down. But if the Abbey doesn't slow me down, I will jump to the questions of Paramartha Samagata. I hereby begin jumping. So the 7th chapter is the questions of Paramartha Samagata. And that's the Bodhisattva who is totally involved with the ultimate. So it's kind of nice to have him talking. And we always begin these by paying careful attention to the question that's being posed to the Buddha in the chapter. And Paramartha Samagata says something like, hey, Buddha, you go around all the time saying that everything's empty. What did you have in mind when you said that? How many times have you been asked that question by somebody, right? I mean, you kind of think the Buddha is going to say, God, how many times do I have to answer the same damn question? But he doesn't. He's a very patient guy. And he says, I'm going to tell you what I mean when I say that things were empty. And he says, Paramartha Samagata, he's so nice, right? He says, what a good question. It's a virtuous question. It's a great question. I'm so happy you asked that question. You're going to make so many other beings happy by asking that question. You see, he just has the same attitude towards questions that I do. You want people to ask questions because somebody else is going to appreciate the answer. So I kind of like that. So that's what the Buddha says. He says, absolutely fabulous question. And I want us to focus for a minute on that question, because by focusing on that question, we once again focus ourselves relentlessly, continuously on the relationship between Yogacara and Madhyamaka. The question is, what in the world did you have in mind, Buddha, when you said that everything is empty? Now, this is obviously a question that's posed with the second turning sutras and texts in mind. So you can imagine Paramartha Samagata. He's just been reading the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, probably the 8,000 line one. He has a really beautiful edition. He's been reading it, and it's telling him that everything is empty, and he's scratching his head and saying, what could that possibly mean? And the reason I emphasize that is that the Buddha doesn't answer by saying, actually, I didn't mean it, I meant something else. Or you completely misunderstood me. Or let me give you a different explanation from the one I gave you before. He said, I'm going to tell you what I meant. And so the Untitled Sutra is not setting itself up in opposition to the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. It's setting itself up as an analysis of the emptiness that's presented in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. I think that's really, really important to bear in mind. You could imagine this being a polemical text. They said, oh, those texts where you read that Paramarta Samagata, those were texts that I wrote for dummies, for people who couldn't really understand the real thing. Those were lousy texts. I didn't mean that stuff. Now let me tell you what's really true. What he's saying is, here's what I had in mind when I said those things then. So he's arguing that this third turning text is not a critique of or an alternative to, but an analysis of the second turning texts. That's something to keep in mind as we read these. There's a kind of irenic coexistence here. So he said I had 3 different ideas about emptiness in mind. I thought that emptiness was of 3 kinds. Now that's something we don't find in the second turning text, of course, but what he's saying is, that's what I really meant. And the way that I would read this is just me, Jay, is to say, yeah, those texts I was talking about what it means for an object to be empty. Now let me tell you what that looks like from the side of the mind. And we're not going to contradict what we said before. We're just going to give a deeper analysis of it. So he says, look, first there's emptiness with respect to characteristics. What's that? That's the imagined nature. Now notice what's happening here. And I think this is really, really important. I'm just going to pause right at this moment to drive a point home that I made earlier, but I want to really emphasize it here with this textual support. If you thought by the end of chapter 6 that, oh God, Yogacara, what a reifying doctrine, because it's saying things have 3 natures. Notice that each of those natures here is being identified with an emptiness. So just as in Madhyamaka, when we say something that you will find in many, many texts, emptiness is the ultimate nature of phenomena. Or in the Ashtahashrika, the 8,000 line Prajnaparamita Sutra, that all things have one nature, that is no nature, right? That the nature of things is to lack nature. You see that we can use the word nature and deny the word nature in slightly different voices. And we just have to be okay with that. Why do we have to be okay with that? Because that's the way the texts are written and that's the way the language works. And wouldn't it be nice if it were less ambiguous? Yes, but the world isn't always that easy. So right here, we have the very explicit identification of each nature with a kind of emptiness as an analysis of the emptiness of phenomena of intrinsic identity. So that was a long way of just pointing out one short thing. Emptiness with respect to characteristics is the imagined nature, because the imagined nature is posited through words and symbols, but things are empty of the characteristics that are posited that way. So when we talk about that first naturelessness or that first emptiness, it's emptiness with respect to characteristic. Let me come back to my apple. The apple is still here. Might not be here tomorrow, I'm not sure. But the apple is still here, and the apple appears to have certain characteristics that are posited in the imagined nature, namely redness, solidity, roundness, sweetness, existence outside of my mind, all of that stuff that we imagine the apple to have. But the apple is empty of all of those things. The apple itself doesn't have those. Only the apple as I experience it has those. They're not intrinsic to the apple. That is the emptiness of the apple with respect to characteristic. So when I say in one sense of emptiness, remember, the Buddha is saying to Paramarta Samagata, hey, Paramarta guy, I'm saying that things are empty in 3 respects, not just one respect, 3. Here's the first one. They don't actually have the characteristics we impute to them. That is a matter of imputation. Okay, first one. And that is associated with the imagined nature. Secondly, things are empty with respect to production. That's their dependent nature, because they come into existence through the force of other causes and conditions, and they are not independent. So when I think about my apple here, it has come to me through a tree and rain and apple seeds and a farmer and a truck and a refrigerator and a shop and all of that stuff. And it depends upon countless causes and conditions to arise. It is not independent. It's part of a dependent, a network of dependent origination. But more than that, the apple as experienced, which is the thing that I care about, the perceived apple, is dependent not only on what might be external causes and conditions, but also upon my eye and my visual faculty and my visual sense consciousness and all of the cognitive processes and perceptual processes that are going on in my mind. So the perceived apple is just the amalgamation of a zillion causes and conditions. And that means that it's empty of being independent. It is dependent. So the Buddha says to Paramartha Samudgata, that's a second respect in which things are empty. One respect is they're empty of characteristics. Another is that they're empty of independence. The emptiness with respect to characteristics is associated with their imagined nature. The emptiness with respect to production or causation is associated with the dependent nature or the other dependent nature. Third, and here's the hard one. The third one's always the hardest, right? Third, Paramartha Samudgata. Things are ultimately empty. Why are they ultimately empty? Because dependent phenomena are empty with respect to production. They are also empty in virtue of lacking any ultimate nature. That is, that when we search for the nature of the apple, the thing that makes it the thing that it is, we don't find it. Why don't we find it? Because all it is the amalgamation of lots and lots of causes and conditions, and not something that exists from its own side. Now, I want to pause for a moment to talk about a few aspects of these three naturelessnesses, or these three kinds of emptiness. And we normally call them, I mean, because this is just a really nice, straightforward rendering of both the Sanskrit and the Tibetan, three natures and three naturelessnesses. And that's nice because it shows you that each nature has a flip side, right? Heads a nature, tails is a naturelessness. You thought that it was really a way that things are, it's really a way that things aren't, which is kind of cool, right? That's nice. We could have also said three natures and three emptinesses, or three kinds of emptiness, or three aspects of emptiness. And that would work as well, because what are things empty of? They're empty of nature. So naturelessness just means that. The nice thing about naturelessness, as I said, is it's cognate with nature. And the other is it's really hard to say. So it really disciplines your tongue. Now, a couple of things about that. One is, again, we can see that the naturelessness with respect to production plays a kind of pivotal role between naturelessness with respect to characteristic and ultimate naturelessness. So that just as when we looked at the three natures, the imagined nature is a kind of projection on the dependent nature, and the consummate nature is the absence of what's projected in the dependent nature. When we look at emptiness with respect to characteristic, things are empty with respect to characteristic because of the kinds of causes and conditions that give rise to our experience of them. And they're ultimately natureless because of the fact that they are just dependently originated and nothing more than that. So that dependent origination and that emptiness with respect to production is kind of right there in tight connection to the other two naturelessnesses, just like the dependent nature is very tightly connected to the other natures. The other thing that the text makes really clear here that is kind of nice, because there's this worry, and I'm trying to find the place that there's this worry that given the tight connection between emptiness with respect to production, that is the second emptiness, and ultimate emptiness, because after all, the text just says, because things are empty with respect to production, they're also ultimately empty. You might say, so what's the big deal? Why are they different from one another? What's the difference between those two naturelessnesses? The Buddha makes that clear in a very nice way that also shows us that we're working from a very subjective side. He says that ultimate emptiness is an object of purification. So the consummate nature and its ultimate emptiness is an object of purification, whereas the dependent nature and dependent origination are not an object of purification. Now, that's a bit of arcane technical terminology, but it's kind of important technical terminology. And again, in order to understand it in a fairly clear way, I want to take us back to Madhyamaka by analogy, and then take a fact that we're all used to from our study of Madhyamaka and bring it forward into our analysis of Yogacara. And I'm going to take us back to Nagarjuna, like I always go back to Nagarjuna, and the 24th chapter of Mula Madhyamaka Karaka. You'll remember that in the 24th chapter of Mula Madhyamaka Karaka, Nagarjuna says that in order to understand the Buddha Dharma, you have to understand the distinction between the two truths. And if you don't understand the distinction between the two truths, you can't understand the Buddha's teaching. Then only a few verses later, he tells us the two truths are the same thing, right? So first you've got to understand their difference, then you've got to understand their identity. And a lot of students over the centuries have looked at that and shaken their heads and saying, which one do you want, right? Do you want them to be different or do you want them to be the same? And the answer to that question is yes. They need to be both the different and the same. Different in one respect, identical in another. Hence that wonderful phrase of Jay Rinpoche's, Lobo Chikla Dokpatadat, one extensionally identical, intentionally distinct. And that's because the way that we experience or understand something is just as important as the thing itself. Very often, do I want an analogy here? Should I do an analogy? I'll do an analogy. So we might say that it's one thing to want to meet and to enjoy talking with the most famous breeder of Welsh corgis in the world, and another thing to want to meet and to talk to Her Majesty the Queen of England. But of course, the most famous breeder of Welsh corgis in the world is Her Majesty the Queen of England. These are two different dokpas, two different aspects under which she appears, but you can't say, on Monday I'll meet the corgi breeder and on Tuesday I'll meet the queen. Well, if you meet the queen, you've met the corgi breeder, but you could meet the queen as the queen or meet the queen in order to buy a corgi, and those are two very, very different things. So you can't bestow knighthoods by being a famous corgi breeder. It doesn't work. No matter how wonderful the corgis are you breed, you can't bestow knighthoods. You can bestow knighthoods if you're the queen, even if you've never bred a corgi. So queens and corgi breeders have very different powers, very different characteristics, very different effects on people, even when they turn out to be identical. So similarly, if you argue that the conventional truth and the ultimate truth are identical in entity, are extensionally identical, and somebody says, great, I know lots of conventional truths, so I know the ultimate truth, so I'm already a Buddha, done. You want to say, not so fast. Even if conventional truth and ultimate truth are extensionally identical, you need to know intentionally what the ultimate truth is in order to gain liberation. And knowing the conventional truth won't get you there, right? And that's a way of saying, using technical terminology, that the ultimate truth is an object of purification, an object of observation for purification, where the conventional truth is not an object of observation for purification, even though they're extensionally the same. Imagine you want nothing more than to be declared a knight. And you say, all I've got to do is find a local corgi breeder and I can get my wish. That doesn't work, right? That doesn't work unless your local corgi breeder has to be just the right person. But it won't be because of the corgis, it'll be because of her lineage. So what the sutra is telling us here is that even though the consummate nature and ultimate emptiness are very tightly connected to the dependent nature and emptiness with respect to production, simply seeing that everything is given rise to by causes and conditions doesn't give you awakening. It's not an object of observation for purification. But if you see that things are ultimately empty and grab that ultimate emptiness, then you've got that other dokpa, right? You've got that other aspect under which it appears. You've got that other intentional way of taking it up. And that gives you the purification. Now notice that doesn't change the emptiness. That changes your subjective apprehension of the emptiness. And that's why we say what we're doing is we're looking at this emptiness from the subjective side. It's one thing to get dependent origination and causation and causal dependency, another to get ultimate emptiness. Then I want to go to the analogy, but before we go to the metaphor and the analogy, I want to ask whether there are any questions at this point. Because this is hard stuff. I don't want your eyes just to glaze over and let the sounds wash over your ears.
Maybe go over then the second and third and how they're
connected. I will do that. I will do that. And please stop me if I'm going too fast or being too confusing. Because again, this is places where the distinctions are fine, the details are fine, and it's really important to get it just right. So what we're doing, let's step back and make sure that we've got the big picture, first of all. The big picture, first of all, is that with each of the three natures that we introduced in the 6th chapter, we're associating a naturelessness or an aspect of emptiness. That's the project. And the project is there because what we don't want to do is to end up reifying those natures and thinking that there's some kind of positive intrinsic characteristics of things. We want to understand that each of those is really a kind of emptiness, a negation, an absence of something. When we think from the side of the object in the Madhyamaka system, and we ask, what is it of which things are empty? The answer to that is straightforward. There's a single object of negation that we're after. Things are empty of intrinsic nature. And the term that we use in its important technical sense is swabhava or rangshin. And all of Nagarjuna's arguments, all of the arguments that we find in the Ashtahashrika and all of these Madhyamaka texts are designed, all of Chandrakirti's arguments are designed to show us that that object of negation can't be found when we look for it, right? And that's really important to see. We also call that the selflessness of phenomena. And you'll see that that same phrase comes up in the Samdhinirmochana Sutra when ultimate emptiness is identified with the selflessness of phenomena. And notice that when the sutra does that, that's an explicit link to second turning texts, right? That's a really explicit link. I'm explicating that idea, the sutra is telling us. I'm not replacing it, I'm explicating it. I'm telling you what the selflessness of phenomena is. So in the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, though, we're not approaching it from the object side, we're approaching it from the subject side. And so by approaching it from the subject side, just as the three natures appear as the three natures of any object of consciousness, any object of consciousness will have an aspect of emptiness or a kind of emptiness or a naturelessness associated with each of those three natures or aspects of an object of consciousness. So associated with the imagined nature is emptiness with respect to characteristic. Emptiness with respect to characteristic means that we impute all of these characteristics to things, but we know that those characteristics are merely imputed. So the thing itself is empty of those characteristics. We put them there, we didn't find them there, right? That's that confusion of what we found with what we made. That's the first emptiness. Set that aside now. Because now, I'm sorry it took so long to wind back to your question, but I wanted context first. So now we come to the second and the third emptinesses. And the trick here is that they're very tightly connected in the exposition, and the exposition is very terse. So the second emptiness is emptiness with respect to production. Or if we were to put it in natural English, we might call it causal emptiness or something. But I like to be fairly close to the Sanskrit and the Tibetan here so that we're really precise about what we're doing. And what that means is that things are empty in the sense that they don't exist on their own, but they only exist in dependence on a network of causes and conditions. And the particular feature I think that's important when we're looking from the Yogacara context, when we're looking in the context of the Samdhinirmochana Sutra, is this, those causes and conditions, because we're talking about objects of knowledge, the things as we perceive them, include our cognitive and perceptual causes and conditions, as well as any external causes and conditions. That part's really important. That is, the apple that I experience only exists for me as an object of knowledge because of the kinds of eyes that I have, because of the kind of nose that I have, because of the kinds of sense faculties that I have, because of the kinds of sense consciousness that I have, because of all of that psychology is what brings that object of knowledge into existence for me. That's emptiness with respect to production. We okay so far? Okay. Now, ultimate emptiness is the lacking of any ultimate nature, the absence of any ultimate nature, the fact that there's no self of phenomena there. And the sutra says that things are ultimately empty because of emptiness with respect to production. So what that means is that we can get to the fact that there's no unique thing, no core to the apple, so to speak, because the apple is brought into existence by all of these things and is dependent on my mind and my sense consciousness as everything else. So when we look for something, oh, here's a nice way to put it maybe. When we look for something beyond the experienced apple that makes that experienced apple what it is, we don't find anything. All we find is that network of causes and conditions that leads me to the experience. And that's why it's got an ultimate emptiness as well. Then the worry arises. The worry arises. If ultimate emptiness is so closely tied to emptiness with respect to production, why bother distinguishing them? What's the difference between the two? Why aren't they just the same thing? And then the answer is, one of them is an object of observation for purification, and one of them is not an object of observation for purification. That's a technical term. What that really means is one of them, if you apprehend it, you really see reality as it is. And the other one, you don't really quite see it all as it is. You still got some work to do. It's not something that generates awakening by itself. And to explain that, I went back to looking at Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti on the account of the relationship between dependent origination and emptiness, and using that wonderful phrase from Jay Rinpoche, the idea that things are extensionally identical, the dependent origination and emptiness are extensionally identical, but intentionally distinct. That is, that they've got the same, they're substantially the same, but seen under two different conceptual guises. Example that I used then was the queen and the corgi breeder, right? And what that means is that we can apprehend dependent origination and dependently originated phenomena without thereby apprehending emptiness, even if dependent origination and emptiness are the same thing. Likewise, sorry this is such a long answer, but it's a hard question. Likewise, we can apprehend emptiness with respect to production without apprehending ultimate emptiness, even though they're very, very tightly linked with one another. And that's why we need to distinguish all three aspects of emptiness, so we get ourselves up to that path point where what we're doing is apprehending the selflessness of phenomena, not just the production of phenomena, not just the absence of characteristics in phenomena. And again, you can see these three as linked in a path structure, which I think is really important, because we're also talking, we're not just talking about the aspects of the object, which we are, and the emptinesses of the object, which we are, because these are, again, three emptinesses of the apple that I experience. But we're also building in a kind of model of path structure that takes us to a transformation of consciousness, from first seeing things as having characteristics and recognizing that they don't actually have the characteristics that they do, then seeing things that are produced and recognizing that because they're produced, they are actually empty of any nature, and then seeing that things are selfless. And that one turns out to be harder. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Good. We're now probably both at a good stopping point, because we've introduced the three natures and we haven't jumped into the analogy, which we can do tomorrow morning, and because we were only a few minutes before closing time. So I think I'll choose this. Oh, I have one question in the back before we close and go to recitations. Yes?
How would you tell the difference between the person who's imagining the apple as we imagine it, as we perceive it, and the person who's thinking about the turtle's mustache?
Thinking about?
Turtle's mustache.
Oh, a turtle. I'm sorry. I thought you said the eternal mustache. And I thought, gee, I'm really missing some Abbey in joke. Yes, that's a very good question. Here's one way to put it. There's a sense in which you might analogize those depending on what you wanted to do, but there's also a sense in which you want to draw a distinction. Turtles' mustaches never appear to people. But apples, externally existing, intrinsically real apples, do appear to people, even if they don't actually exist. So turtles' mustaches, and I like the eternal mustache though, turtles' mustaches and intrinsically real apples, independent apples, are equally non-existent, but one appears and one doesn't. So you'd use them for different analogies. Does that help? Unless you take the right pills, perhaps. I think we'll stop here. Thanks, everybody.